Go ahead, Noel.
I'm Noelle Picara. I'm the Arts Integration Specialist at Lumba Academy, and I'm the co-chair.
Kelly. Oh,
Hi, I'm Kelly Sherritts. I'm with the Institute for Public Administration and supporting the work group.
Dania. Gotta hit the mute button.
I did the same thing, I'm sorry. I'm Dania Woods. I am an educator within the Red Clay School District.
Okay. What else do we have here? Hold on, let's go through. Go ahead, James.
Oh. Good afternoon, James Simmons. I'm the Director of Innovation and Improvement for DOE.
All right. Let's see. Who else do we have on there? Is Shelly's on, right, Shelly? I think I see Shelly.
Hi there. Hi. Hi, good evening, everyone. I'm Shelly Rouser, and I am the chairperson for education at Delaware State University.
Ray, I think I saw you. Can you introduce yourself?
Yes, this is Ray Avery. I'm with the Wilmington Center for Education, Equity, and Public Policy.
Great. Abigail?
Hi, Abigail. I'm with University of Delaware Institute for Public Administration.
Fran?
Hi, Fran O'Malley, Institute for Public Administration.
All right. Those are everyone I see. I see some other numbers and things. I'm not sure if you're a part of the subcommittee or of the public. If you're part of the subcommittee, can you introduce yourself now for us? All right, that makes it easy. At the end, we will have time for public comment, and that'll be 3 minutes. So please wait to the end for public comment. She is on mute and has to take another call, but I do want to recognize Senator Elizabeth Lockman, who is the chair of the Full Reading Consortium, who's with us tonight. And Senator Lockman, if you'd like to say anything, go ahead. Fantastic. All right, let's keep it moving then, guys. All right, so we did welcomes and introductions. Recap from the last meeting real quick, and then I'm going to turn it over to you, Noelle. But recap from the last meeting, we met as the Full Reading Consortium and delivered our recommendations that we had been working on. Overall, all 4 recommendations were approved, and those were conditional on questions. So we'll go through some of those questions tonight. Afterwards, and looking at deliverables, we wanted to focus on recommendations 1 and 4, and Noelle will go into that a little bit. But we wanted to go through that and go through the questions that were asked so we could give you more of the background information so we're all comfortable to submit those to the full consortium, as well as develop that path forward in terms of discussing and implementing that plan. Noelle?
So basically, we wanted to come back to you with the information that the IPA team put together to answer the questions that were brought up by the consortium members. So here's a list of questions, and I'll just give you a minute to review those. And then we can go through the slides and see if you think, you know, if these adequately address these questions, how we can weave them into the recommendations, and if there's any follow-up things that need to be clarified or tweaked. So does anyone have any questions about the questions as far as understanding what they were, or we clear on that? We good to go?
Hi, this is Jim Simmons. I have a question or maybe a clarification on when you say the city school turnover rate, is that for staff? Or is that also for students leaving those schools to go to other schools?
It's a good question. I believe the data that we put together was teachers and administrators.
Mm-hmm.
That's correct.
Yes, it was.
Again, Jim Simmons, I think while that is certainly important, we also should look at what is the rate of the turnover for students, because I think that is a huge portion of the things that we're dealing with as well.
I think that's a good point to follow up on.
Yep, so we'll make a note of that, Jim, and dive into that.
Any other questions, or we need to clarify the questions before we move on?
This is Danielle. I was looking at the fourth bullet. What are the demographics of teacher academies? And by teacher academies, you mean like the teacher preparation programs that are in the universities, or are you talking about like Teach for America? Like what specifically in the state of Delaware or elsewhere?
So this is Noelle. I believe that the question at the consortium was about students who are in high school,
Yes, that's correct.
who are in like those kind of programs where they're interested in teaching.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so the first question was about how do we define high needs school? And this comes from the ESSA definition. So we see there's several different indicators. And then on the next slide, we'll be looking at how each school within the city of Wilmington breaks down according to these criteria. So in this chart, I actually have to move everybody over in order to see it. I don't know if you guys need to do that too. But in this chart, we see highlighted the schools that meet the criteria, the ESSA guidelines for a high needs school. So just take a minute to look over the chart. If anything stands out to you, please feel free to chime in.
And so one clarification from our last meeting was we listed the number 18, and that was something people got stuck on to wanting to know if was that high needs schools within the city limits or that fed from the city limits. So the 18 reflects, I believe, 18 that feeds from the city limits, with 12 actually being within the city limits. Is that correct, Kelly?
So no, so in this chart that you're seeing here, it is all of the schools that fall within the city limits.
All 18. So there were 18 that fell within the city limits.
Right, but then the highlighted ones are the high need schools based off of the definition that we had.
Okay, so that's the distinction that we want to make to the full consortium based off of those questions. There were 18, but only 12 were considered high needs.
I'm sorry, I don't see the function for waving your hand or raising your hand if you want to speak. This is Ray.
Yeah, I don't see that indicated from my end either. So just go ahead and unmute and go ahead when you have.
It's under participants. If you look under participants, it's there.
Oh, okay, thank you. So I'll do that the next time. So since I have your attention. Thank you, Shelley. I think it's really, really critical that I understand this federal definition of what constitutes a high needs schools, but given the charge of the consortium and given the residual of our students being continue to be bused outside of the city of Wilmington, I really urge us to look at try to come to agreement on a threshold in terms of the school population to consider those schools that geographically are not situated in the city of Wilmington, but where large numbers of city of Wilmington students attend, particularly at the high school level.
Right. And
I have that same concern as well.
Yeah. And then Christina,
yeah, we can't have just a geographic, or we can't just have a geographic delineation and just the federal definition.
Yeah.
Because that's just not the way we're organized.
Yeah.
Agreed.
That's all I want to say. Thank you. So let me unmute myself.
So I think that, I mean, we keep talking about 18 schools, but I agree with you, and I'm thinking specifically about like Mount Pleasant, for example. Is it within our scope to be able to include those schools in this chart?
I think it would be interesting if we could, Kelly, and IPA team, to include even like Glasgow, Christiana, Newark, because those, as Ray mentioned, those are all schools, especially in high school, that feed from the city of Wilmington.
So if we go back to the previous slide where it talked about the percent, let me see, the percent of low income, Well, if we were clear enough to say that if X percent of the students are coming from the same zip codes that we use for the 18, then I think we can be really clear about our criteria there. So as long as we name that and then pick schools that have X percentage of students that are coming from the city zip codes, then I think we will have at least a clear criteria that we can defend for why certain schools were picked over others.
Again, this is Jim Simmons. I think we also got to be careful when we think about that there really is no city high school, excluding Charter and Howard. Then you're going to start including most of the high schools. Like if I heard someone mention Mount Pleasant, well, then you've got Brandywine, you've got Concord, you got McCain, you got Dickinson. So then we start to, do we become too broad by doing that? So we've just got to be mindful. And I think to Shelley's point, maybe the data will help us limit. I don't know that it would, because I think most of the districts have tried to do some kind of equity around balancing the equity of those low performing and those people who are underserving with that, by that definition of high needs.
Okay. Yeah, to Shelley's point, though, I think it would be good to be able to know one way or the other, if we could. So if we could at least try to match it, I think that would be a good start. That way we can see if we should expand it or not. I mean, to your point, it could get too broad, right, in terms of a recommendation, because we really want to model it and then see how to grow it. But it would be good to at least know, I think, as a start.
And just getting back to the intention of this, the reason that we want to do this was to make sure that we're actually in the interest of equity, serving high need schools and not giving resources to schools that are already well resourced. So I think it makes sense. I'm wondering, Kelly, if we can come back to this in the email thread to add the other schools in to the data chart and maybe just highlight the other ones that are high needs that are outside of the city of Wilmington, so that we really are focusing on high need schools and not just schools within the city limits of Wilmington.
That's fine. I think we can look at, definitely see what we have in that area, as well as looking at northern Newcastle County for that. So I can have our team pull that together and send it out via the email chain and go from there.
Wonderful, thank you.
This is Fran. I'm wondering, should there be sub-plans considered, like particularly in light of what the state budget's going to look like next year? Are you thinking of starting small and then going bigger? Or are you thinking of doing all 12 simultaneously with Plan B, maybe doing all 18, things like that?
So this is Mike Smith again. One thing I would say is that I think we need a small, mid, and like large level strategy when it comes to that. We can't just have a one size fits all. I mean, just to bring in everything we're dealing with and why we're on a Zoom call instead of being in person, our state budget could be completely different than anyone ever anticipated because of the recovery process for this COVID-19. So I think we need to look at almost even one school as a model, all the way to what we could do if it was this bigger group, maybe the 12 or even more if you include some of the high schools or whatnot, to do that. Because and what that would take, because it very well could just be one school, if any. I want to be realistic because of the recovery process and what that could mean in terms of the budget.
And I also think, this is Kelly, when we get towards the end of the presentation and talk about how the group wants to move things forward, we can also figure out how we do come up with that plan as well.
Might also want to be thinking about, or and maybe even researching, what's the number of students from the city going into the suburban schools, and might that be a criteria for determining, you know, for whom the recommendations applied. So you've got 3 students going into a school versus 300, you know, for the city.
Good point.
Okay, so we're ready to move on then to the next question. And this was the one which was about the turnover rate of teachers and leadership. So it has the percentage and then the total number of teachers and then the number for the turnover in the last year.
And how does that compare to overall turnover rate in the state?
It's a good question. I feel like maybe we could put that into a comparison chart.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I want to say it was higher. This is Kelly, but I can't quote the number off the top of my head.
Right.
This
I
is
was, yeah.
the number is higher than the state, but yeah, I can get the actual number to have it compared.
Okay.
I'm actually wondering now that I'm looking at this in the conversation that we just had about the high need schools, Kelly, when we revisit this, would it make sense for us to weed through and find those high need schools in the city and the high need schools that are the kids from the city are going to, and look at the turnover rate of all of those schools rather than just the schools within the city limits?
I think I have the same question in my head as you. So if this is all the schools, but not the ones that we're specifically looking at, so does this city turnover rate, in other words, include some charter schools like Wilmington Charter that are offsetting the numbers of turnover rate overall? I guess that's a question I have.
That's a very good question. Abby, do you have the answer to that, or do you want us to pull it?
I'm actually trying to find our data set, and I could answer that. It does include charter schools. I want to make sure that if Wilmington Charter School is included.
And Cab Callaway and maybe some others as well. Montessori. There could be some, well, I don't know much about the demographics of Montessori, but certainly a couple of them might be throwing this number off. I was expecting it to be higher.
So I'm wondering, when we revisit this in the email, if it could be a more detailed breakdown rather than just the number, of showing exactly which schools are included.
We do have that. We can pull each school, or we can group all the high need schools together.
I think we just need the high needs one really for the purpose of what we're doing, right? If we just take these schools out and say these are the schools that meet X number of criteria,
okay,
or X number of these demographics, then I think those are the schools that we can make sure this percentage matches up with.
Yeah, so these numbers include Charter School of Wilmington, Cab Callaway.
Yeah.
So all of those are in Wilmington.
Yeah, so that's throwing us off big time.
So for next time then, just the high need schools that we identify with the question before, schools serving high need students, and then also comparison to the state as a whole.
Mm-hmm.
Any other clarifying questions about this question or this slide?
Could we consider doing just the high need schools, just the city schools within the city district, and then the state, and see if that's a dramatic difference?
Yeah, I can grab those numbers and then have a comparison for you all.
Yeah, just having a comparison chart of all of those things and showing how the charter excuse the number, I think would be a good thing.
Yeah.
Well, and to the point you guys were talking about a moment ago about the current crisis. I think that having that information really broken down will help us if we want to advocate for equity as far as the distance learning initiatives and things like that, or the support that schools need moving forward through and after this, if we have that information really detailed.
Absolutely. And somebody has, I think it's
It's
Ray has
Ray.
her hand raised.
Yes, it's not just charters that skew the numbers. It's not that they're charters, it's that you have high performing or higher performing schools mixed in based on geography with high need schools.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying that. So I think they were referring to the schools that were not high needs, not designated as high needs. Those were Wilmington Charter, Cap Calloway, and First State Montessori. A lot of the other charter schools were designated as high needs. So we're trying to make the distinction that it's not all schools in the city, it's not all charter schools or all public schools. It's the ones that specifically meet the high needs criteria.
And that's the group I'm speaking of, not all.
The other question that I have is about making a state comparison. And making a state comparison, does that mean that those high need schools that are in other locales of the state will be pulled out of the state comparison number? Because otherwise you run the risk of the same skewing.
Yeah, so that's why I was wondering, like, when we're comparing it to something, what are we comparing it to? Is it the statewide? Is it Newcastle County? You know, how do we want to, what does make sense in order to show? And what, because we're trying to show is the turnover rate of high need schools versus, the other way to compare it would be to take those schools out, right? And then compare it to the turnover rate.
So it's really high needs versus non-high needs, because if
Yes.
otherwise we compare it to all. So we really just need to have two groups: high needs
Right.
in the city, and then non-high needs. And then maybe that other number that Mike was talking about, which is to show how some charters kind of throw things off in the city limits, if we just want to throw that in for conversation purposes.
So Kelly and Abigail, what I'm thinking is, I guess we could take that chart and the schools that are highlighted in blue as high needs, look at those, and then also look at the turnover rate of the ones that are not highlighted in blue. I like that idea a lot, the comparison of the two, because I think whenever you do an average, it's, you know, kind of moot because those schools are included in the average.
Sounds good.
Sounds good.
Are we ready to move on?
Yep, let's do it.
Right, so this was specifically about the high school prep programs. So students who are in the clubs, I'm forgetting the name of it right now. Future Teachers of America and those teacher academies.
So this is just the teacher academies.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a bit of a longer reach goal, of course, because those students wouldn't be going into the profession for a number of years.
And this is Kelly. I also think it's important to note when you look in the recommendations themselves, it does list what schools they attend as well. And they aren't all necessarily schools that the population that we're looking at attend. So I think that's something as we're working through the recommendations, we just need to think about.
Are you saying that these academies are not in high need schools?
Correct. Or
Okay.
or necessarily the ones that the city of Wilmington students go to.
So where the academies are, is it a question, or is it saying that that's what's happening, that the places where the academies are not the predominant places where students from the city are going? Or
They're
is that
not.
something
They're not the predominant ones.
they're not? Interesting.
And I think that's relevant also because if we go back to the Grow Our Own initiative about students who are going to return to high need schools to teach there, we might not be looking at the same group of students. And I'm wondering in future recommendations also about establishing more teacher academies in the high need schools.
Another factor to consider is in some schools, I've heard Rita speak of this, Havermail at department, and I've also heard administrators in school districts sometimes bring this up, is that there have been cases where students are stumbling into the teacher academy. And so when you look at the breakdown, it'll be important if we could dig under this, behind this number a bit, to see which students are in the academies because they're passionate about becoming a teacher, and which students are in these academies. So maybe that's data that the Department of Education has. I don't know how much Rita had a year ago, but I know that she wanted to dig some more. She might have it more now, but if she has, I don't know if I'm being really clear, but there are students who are very passionate about continuing into teaching, and there's students who have just looked at the options of an academy or of a pathway. They have to choose a pathway in high school. And if we end up finding that there are more students who might be the teachers of these schools that aren't choosing that as their number one choice, but place in it, then that could be a problem as well.
I just received some information from Jeff Klein. He
Okay.
was on the call. I don't see him right now. They were doing some survey work and work with Rita, and I can send that around as well.
Okay.
Great, thank you.
It's
Where they
Fran.
did dig into some of that. Go ahead, Fran. Sorry.
In terms of schools in the vicinity that have teacher academies, Glasgow High School, William Penn High School, let's see, AI and McKean. They're the four.
Interesting.
Not necessarily in the city, but that serve students in the city.
Mm-hmm.
And the other question that came up also was about the demographics of these groups. So if the desire in particular is to try to recruit teachers of color, we have the demographic data on that too. So there's 2,335 totally enrolled. And Black or African American is 791. Hispanic and Latino is 295. $1,699 females and 636 males. Oh, that's there. There are the demographics. Sorry. I'm bouncing back and forth between computers.
I'm sorry. I tried.
Did you switch that, Kelly?
No.
Fran, you know I love you.
Too many
Zoom
boxes.
And that makes me think about also that when we're talking about recruiting teachers, we kind of had two different ideas, right? One of them was growing our own teachers from the community, kind of like Jackie had talked about from Eastside Charter. And then the other idea is recruiting teachers of color. And teachers of diverse language backgrounds and things like that who might not necessarily have gone to in the first place, but might be more familiar with some of those challenges.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any other things that need to be clarified about this data before we bring it back to the consortium?
I don't think so. I think it's good to send.
Yeah, so as we go through, just kind of thinking about ways that we can give the IPA some notes that they can refine this so that when we bring it to the consortium, it really makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's move on. So here were some other questions from the consortium, and instead, because these aren't really hard data questions, you can just keep these in mind as we go throughout the rest of the document, the recommendations document, and consider these questions. Okay, so here's our revised recommendations.
Give me 1 second and I will attempt to switch to the Word document.
Sounds good. I could sing a little medley.
All right, let's go sing, Noel.
Now, do you see the Word document?
Yes.
Yes. And while we're going through these, just so everybody knows, Abby and Ellie are behind the scenes. They're going to try to make edits while we're in the document if we don't break it.
So Kelly, can you advise us a little bit about what we should pay attention to in this document? Like what exactly has been changed so that we're not just, reading straight through it, but what should we be focusing on in the text?
Absolutely. So just a little bit of background, what we have been doing since the IPA team has been doing since the last meeting is, in addition to answering the questions via the numbers that we just shared, we've also added in more meat and bolstered the recommendations. So I went through before I sent this out to you all and highlighted in blue areas that we needed to talk about and come up with decisions for. So I think one thing that did come up, and you guys had the conversation, was the diverse high quality educators in City of Wilmington schools and high need schools. So the work group, I think, needs to just say, here are the schools that we're hoping this will impact and influence, knowing that it will eventually hit statewide as well.
I'm actually wondering too, when we're looking at this, because we really wanted to qualify what does high needs mean. Did we also qualify like what high quality educators mean? And, is that data included in like the teacher turnover and the teacher retention data, like how many of those high quality and how we define that teachers are there currently?
Right now it's just looking at the teachers that are there.
Hi, this is Jim. I agree with Noel. I think we also make an assumption that because you're a new educator, a novice educator, that you're not high quality. And while you may be growing in the profession, I'd like to think that when I was I'll say a second year teacher, I was pretty good, but maybe that, I'm a little biased as well. But I think we've got to be careful that just saying because they're novice or young teachers that they're not high quality. So we've got to be very careful.
Yeah, do we have a criteria of how we're defining high quality educators? Does it go by their performance evaluations or?
That's my question.
We haven't, to my knowledge, focused on that at all, and I do think that's a really slippery slope. I think Jim makes a really good point too. I've met many first-year teachers that are very high quality by my estimation, but by no specific definition. So how are we? That's a really good question. How are we going to do that?
And we don't have to necessarily leave high quality in right now. It could just say diverse educators in City of Wilmington schools.
Yes, but in many of our meetings, we also talked about how we do not want, there's certain folks, right, or teachers that you also don't necessarily want to create a process and procedure to keep them in the profession, right? And those would be non-high qualified teachers. So I think it's important, but I'd love to hear everyone else's feedback about that.
And this is Noelle. I agree with Mike Kelly. I think that the high quality educators is essential to the point in what we learned in the first few consortium meetings about a high quality educator's impact on a school and on their students, and that those are the teachers that we want to recruit and retain in high need schools. And I agree, it doesn't necessarily have to be by number of years, especially if we're looking at recruiting more, for example, young Black male teachers. They're not necessarily going to have 20 years of experience because we know that there's a deficit in the workforce right now. So there has to be another way to determine that they're high quality teachers. You know, is it test scores? Is it their DPAS evaluation? Is it their principals evaluation? What is it?
Yeah, or is it a combination of a bunch of things, right? And percentage breakdown, like, well, how do we do that?
And much like high need schools defining that, it could be the person must meet 3 out of the 5. I mean, you got National Professional Standards Board teachers, you've got Teachers of the Year. So there's other things. Something you might also include there is the word promising to contend with that high quality. So you might have a very promising teacher by the judgment of many, in addition to high quality. So it could be promising and high quality educators. If you want to try to figure out a way to get around that high quality and not lose the ones you're describing, early career people.
Since we know that high quality was mentioned prior to, why don't we try to figure out what definition they use? Because I think if not, then we should maybe consider taking it out, even though we know it's valuable. Because some of the things people just rattled off, I think, are also some things that are subjective. When you, like, if you haven't done any cross-referencing or any calibration of those DPAS evaluations, you know, my evaluation on someone looks much different than Fran's or Noelle's. And so we've got to, if there's no calibration, that skews our data as well.
This is Mike again. Ray, in past iterations of the consortiums and dealing with the educators specific, did you guys speak of defining high quality at all, or you didn't think through kind of a rubric or measurement in that regard? Just curious in terms of historically.
Yeah, I can go back and look at the report. As a matter of fact, I'll grab one while we're on the phone. I don't recall specifically, but I do know that how high quality is defined is probably one of the most hotly contested and debated kind of things in the educational system. So let me get back to you, but I do like the idea of coupling high quality. I think we should try to come up with a working definition, but I mean, people will debate it, no matter how solid it is. And but I like the idea. I don't see the other speaker's name. Is to couple that with promising as well.
Okay.
I think one thing we want to be prepared for are the.
I think they our report talked about effectiveness. We didn't use the word quality. I don't think.
Okay.
I'm going to go look at it right now.
That makes sense.
I'm going to go look it up.
Yeah, I think the group needs to be prepared for a definition of high quality, meaning the teacher's ability to increase students' test scores.
It has to be way more than that. Is that the
I'm not,
big contention?
yeah, I'm not lobbying for that. I'm just thinking there are probably people who will be encouraging that line of thinking.
Yeah, I agree. But assessing proficiency and using test scores as a singular measure are not really the same. So some people will argue for growth.
Yes. But I'm just thinking I believe there's some research coming out of places like Tennessee and North Carolina, maybe Georgia too, that are suggesting that change came about in high need schools when high quality teachers, as few as 5 or 6 of them, were planted in the schools, and they were able to develop a culture there. And they saw the turnaround that took place as a result of that intervention. So I'm not arguing for it. I'm just saying that it's something to keep on everybody's mind.
Understood.
This is Noelle. I like the languaging of highly effective because it's aligned with DPAS and also because it's student focused more, thinking about the student outcome rather than the teacher's innate quality, which seems a little bit vague. And I'm wondering about saying the language proven or promising highly effective. So they're either proven to be highly effective or they're promising that they're going to be highly effective. And I know we're getting a little bit into the weeds here on this one small point, but I do think this is important as far as how we're getting our data to show which schools need this kind of intervention, where they were starting, who exactly we want to be in that school, and then be able to measure the effects of it.
One idea too is to bring this back and come up with a working definition in partnership with the full consortium, since they were already okay with that language to begin with, versus to Ray's point, we could put a working definition in, but the problem if we do that, it just starts a debate versus being inclusive of coming up with something that we can be unified on.
I think that's a smart idea. Okay, I have let me see, in this report for They Matter Most, Invested in Wilmington's Children and Delaware's Future, issued by the Neighborhood Schools Committee. The definition, they use the National Commission on Teaching in America's Future for teacher quality. And this is 20 years old.
Okay. Sorry, I was talking on mute. Like I said not to.
Could you repeat that one more time? You said National Commission
on Teaching in America's Future. Nope, I'm scanning it now.
Kelly, do we want to stay here for a moment or move on to the next point?
I'm thinking, I'm looking at, so based off of the conversation, so do we just want to change it, leave high quality in, and when they ask, push it back to the consortium, or add highly effective, take out high quality, or some of everything above? I'm just trying to make sure we're all on the same page and we don't go change something and you all are like, nope, not what we wanted.
Mike, were you suggesting that we bring all these ideas to the consortium and ask them what do they think about it?
I think so, versus coming up with a working definition ourselves. Correct.
So Kelly, is it possible we could kind of, leave this as a point where we have several possibilities and we haven't decided on one and we bring it to them to discuss?
I don't see why not. So we can definitely do that. All right, we'll make that note. So let's move on to the. So I'll let you guys read through all the national. So in response to the question, some of the questions that we had and just our own desire to take even more of the research that we had used and heard about, we added in some of the national concerns and what is happening. Abby, you can jump in as well. And then we talked about each state concern. So we started with teacher recruitment. What are the national concerns? What are the Delaware state concerns for Delaware? Put in some even more data to answer the questions about promising practices. What are other states doing? What does this look like? And a lot of what our recommendations have thus far align with what is in this document. And like we've said before, it's not everything that will solve every problem, but this is just where the work group has gotten thus far. So scrolling down to page, what are the page numbers disappeared? To the develop a grow your own program. So now we're in right now the writing consortium recommendations. So these are all the recommendations that we had shared with the group from recommendation 1 and recommendation 4, because they seem to be in discussion when we were talking with Mike, Noel, and as a smaller group planning to be the 2 that the consortium really grabbed onto. So we wanted to make those meatier first, and then we can jump into 2 and 3 later on if we decide to as a group. So looking at the develop a grow your own, first, as we were talking about the teachers academies, and we just define what they are, programs of study in high schools. We say that the work groups recommend that IHEs create partnerships with already established and new teacher academies. This will help create a pipeline from schools to post-secondary programs and hopefully ultimately back to Delaware schools. And then in the blue highlight is what we've asked, would like some feedback on. We were just talking about the partnership could help increase the number of students entering teacher preparation programs in Delaware. What data points do you all think we should use for that would be one question. And do you agree that this would help possibly increase the number of students teaching?
Well, this is Jim Simmons. I'll break the proverbial silence. I think there's a couple things. I think that one, I think I've mentioned this at a previous meeting, the number of people that change their major when they go to college is drastic. I don't know what the number is, right? But it's pretty drastic. I know I changed mine to education in this case. And so I don't know that being in that program will necessarily create that alignment. But I think if we add something to that in terms of the incentive, like I remember at one point, if you went into the program, there were scholarship opportunities, and that may allow people to, I'm gonna say, incentivize people to align those programs versus just being in them and trying to keep them.
And we do note some of those incentives underneath the strengthening the teacher pipeline, Jim. Thank you.
And I do know that, sorry, this is Mike again. I do know that at UD, Dean Henry has something he's going to roll out in that regard. Again, if that's specific to be a part of state funding too, though, who knows where that is? So it could just be what the university can do for now. But it would be interesting from DSU, UD, WilmU, Goldie, wherever, if we could figure out within our own state, the groups of higher ed, that if they could give us those numbers, if they have those numbers, people that transition out of that major. And I'm sorry, I wanted to come online to break the ice, but my dogs were going wild.
I don't have DSU's numbers at the top of my head on the number of students that come in for education and leave, but I can say that
for every one that leaves, I feel like I get another one that comes in. So I don't see this mass exodus by the time they, as many as might change their major and say, I came in education and now want to be in social work. As soon as I'm signing one of those, I feel like another student is coming in and leaving an area and coming to education. So I don't see a mass exodus once they've come to college and decide to choose education overall. But that's just like, in my head data. We could certainly try to
But
see if
anecdotally,
we can
you
pull.
think kind of a wash in your.
It feels like it's a wash. When I think about the papers that I'm signing, I don't get flooded with those exiting. And I feel like as soon as, because every time I sign one of these, I am like, okay, I got to have a conversation with the student. And then the next thing that I'm getting is a paper that's coming in saying, some student that's dying to get into education. So yes, it's a natural part, just as James pointed out, but I don't think it's this massive exodus. Once they've gotten to that point, they're pretty bought in. And then sometimes they're changing between majors. So they're staying in education and they were changing their majors. They're just moving from early childhood to elementary or vice versa. I do think that, the data, and I don't know if I have this stat completely correct, but it's pretty close to it, that 60% of teachers return to teach within like 18 miles of where they graduated from high school. And so that's a national data point. I don't know what it says about our students in high school and where they come back to. I don't know if we have that data point. It'll be interesting to see if what happens in Delaware is common with what the national statistic is. But that stat alone makes it a sure bet for us when it comes to grow your own. If people are drawn, if those who go into teaching are drawn to kind of go back home, or at least 60% do. And who knows what that number looks like beyond within 18 miles, what percent of teachers actually go back to their state in general. Then that's a pretty strong bet for us for a strong pool of candidates to come back to Delaware and to come back to these schools in particular.
Okay. Yeah, anecdotally and speaking with UD and seeing a number of teachers actually just going through it, I hear the same thing.
I just shot an email to our folks at UD asking the questions.
So we can definitely find out that information. This is Kelly.
So you're looking for the numbers of students who come in and to major in education, but then exit. Okay.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
So hopefully we can pull on more of those, pull that in. Go ahead, Mike.
Sorry to interrupt, but to be fair to your point, Shelley, it'd be good to also know the data, how many are trying to change majors to get into education.
Mm-hmm.
Because to your point, it won't tell the right story if we just say X left, but we don't have any idea what Y is doing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, this is Fran. I asked the 3 questions. It was basically how many leave as education majors, how many transition while in college, transition in, and then how many are in-state versus out-of-state? What percentage of the students as education majors are in versus out-of-state?
Okay.
So one question that the consortium had as we are doing this is how will we monitor and what data points might we use to see if this is making a difference, to see if there's an increase in students coming in. So I'm not sure if we have anything for this one yet, or if we want to wait and see what DOE or Rita is starting to track once students are actually getting out of the teacher academies. and going into higher ed.
Yeah, it sounds like we need DOE and higher ed to be working in concert on that. That way the data is flowing and, you know, there's more of a continuum pipeline of that.
Okay.
This is Noelle. It seems to me like there's several parts of that pipeline that would be useful to have. So how many students are going from the teacher academy and then actually completing or, you know, going to a teacher, an education major, you know, how many of them are completing their major, and then how many of them are returning to Delaware to teach. It seems like there's several points at which the students might depart from that pipeline, right? And if we could identify where the breakdown is, it might help to figure out, you know, do they need more incentive to stay in Delaware, or do they need more incentive to major in education or to stay in that program? And then how can we strengthen that? And I'd be interested in seeing also, I mean, ideally, if we could see how many teachers are going all the way through. I don't know if that data exists. It seems pretty complicated, but also if increasing and making these programs more robust in other states, showing some comparison of data, that might be helpful as well.
So I can say this, the academies are fairly new, the teacher academy. The ones that have existed over the years have been the early childhood education pathway. But when it comes to the K-12 pathway, I believe it's maybe 3 years or so that's been in existence, maybe a little more, but we haven't, there won't be data at this point on them going through the complete teacher pathway and then going through our universities and coming back yet. So we're just beginning to see those students come to our universities having gone through the pathway. And of course, some of those students came in kind of later in the game when that pathway became available. But as far as students who've gone through all 4 years, I think it is of the pathway, we're only beginning to see them as freshmen at
I
the high
agree, Shelley,
for
that's right.
K-12. Excuse me?
That's right. We
Yeah.
don't, you know, it hasn't been around that long, so we won't have any data about how many of them complete the program or stay in Delaware, but we
Yeah.
certainly could try to find out how many of them have been in the pathway and then have graduated and entered a university.
Got it. Yep.
And Jim just added in the chat, prior to the pathway, there were clubs like FEA, so that's data we could consider as well for older data.
Mm-hmm. And just to add, that's part of what the second part of the Develop a Grow Your Own program relates to as well. So we can pull some of those numbers and use those for data points.
I think it's important too when we talk about grow your own. Of course, every district wants to make sure they're bringing students back to their district, but it's important in Delaware that we consider grow your own at another level too. You know, if districts are swapping between districts, that's not going to be a bad thing. I mean, we're so tiny that, you know, collaborations in terms of just having a grow your own mindset of coming back. There can be incentives to come back to the district, and there can be incentives just to come back to Delaware or come back to the county. You know, those are things to think about. And in this case, we're talking about coming to city schools in particular versus coming back to Delaware. And coming to high need schools, I should say, in particular.
Okay, it sounds like we fleshed that out pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, let's
So
keep
we
it moving.
move on.
So I think the same conversation, kind of talking about the teacher academies, we were talking about how other programs exist and also using those, such as Jim mentioned, FEA, and all of those, as well as bringing students in and making a concerted effort to do that.
Yeah, I think our discussion just encapsulated both of those data points, both of those blue highlighted points in the top. And I think we could probably move on to the strengthen the
Yep.
teacher pipeline.
Mhm.
Absolutely. So as we had mentioned in the past, and I'm not going to read the whole thing because that we had talked about the scholarship and tuition forgiveness programs for students entering or current entering into preparation or current teachers. So one of the recommendations was to possibly expand, provide increased funding. So we had said that the Department of Education would need to work with the legislature to increase the funding. And baseline data would include the number and amount of scholarships and loan forgiveness provided. And I did talk some with the higher ed office, and they did say that these were scholarships that were used a lot, and there is not, many times there are more people applying than can be funded. Any heartburn with this one, or?
So Kelly, I know like with the first one we looked at, you actually had a question there. With this one, are you looking for us to kind of tweak the language or ask questions about the clarity?
Either if it makes sense or if they are the right data points to be using or people to be working on it. Hopefully you just say, yes, we like it, but if not, and other groups should be working on it, let me know.
So we're just looking to see that we don't see any problems with it.
Correct.
Okay.
And you can support at least 80% of it.
I have another idea here. It's new thinking, and it's around our residency initiatives in the state and the goal of this work in particular. So I don't know what happens when it comes to residency experiences, but I wonder where students are doing residencies and how many students are having residency experiences in these schools that we're speaking of, in particular, the schools that need it most. The residency experience will allow them to have a more deep experience in the schools and be connected and have, double basically the experience that traditional teacher programs are giving. So the question I have is, where are residency experiences happening right now? How many of them are happening in the schools that we outlined a few slides ago? And then what would it take to build residency experiences in these schools? Now, a lot of things go into play when you're trying to put students in that deep, rich, extended experience. And, I feel personally responsible that I want to put students in an experience where the leader is strong, where they're going to be in a strong learning community of teachers. And right now, the data is telling us that there's more turnover than usual. The data we looked at a few months ago showed some question marks around leadership practices when we were looking at that data that came back from educators. So I think if we were to establish, say, like some model sites, then those would be rich training ground for our teachers. And then they'd be able to go out and serve in many schools, but there would be, this rich professional learning site where they have a residency experience in a couple of schools that have all the conditions in place to be able to serve in that role. And maybe there could be some incentivizing even for a school to be designated as a site, but if we could establish that kind of learning center, that rich learning hub in a city school, then that's a place for these teacher candidates to have an extended experience.
And I think, Shelley, I'm going to circle back to that in a minute because that is part of one of our other recommendations is looking at the residency programs.
I think it ties, okay,
and that
great.
Ties in, yes.
Yeah, and it ties to this pipeline in terms of strengthening the pipeline. If the teachers have that richer, long residency experience, I think they'll be a little bit more vested in the district, and also in continuing to serve in these city schools.
Absolutely.
Ray has her hand raised and has also put in a note of, do we know what percentage of scholarship recipients actually teach in high needs schools where Wilmington students attend in significant numbers? Did you want to say something else about that, Ray?
No, that's my question.
Okay, so maybe we need that data as well.
Mhm.
Again, making sure resources aren't going already to teachers who have a lot of resources.
Right. So I can say that the critical needs program, reimbursement program, and high needs low repayment, I believe are for teachers teaching in high needs or high areas. But I can clarify that for you.
Thank you.
And I just want to encourage everybody to, you can use the chat function. It makes it really quick and easy for us to go through and see all of the comments. If we get to one and a lot of people have comments, we can scroll through it pretty quickly and have a record of it.
Put in some numbers in here. Do we have any other questions on this specific piece of the strengthening the teacher pipeline? Because the net, Ray, is your hand still raised for this one?
Mm-mm.
No. Okay.
Let me take it down.
Okay, so then the next one, the work group recommending that possibly the P20 Council should use its unique role in bringing together the P12 and higher education community. That is stemming back to the recommendation about just making sure that there is increased conversation between the higher eds and as well as K-12 to figure out and know what the needs are of the K-12 system. So for this one, we would hope it would increase the pipeline, but also recruitment and retention efforts.
Kelly, Jim asked if P12 is supposed to be K12. I also noticed there's a typo in their role. Looks like it's this kind of role instead.
No, Nicole, actually, it's supposed to be P, and there's conversation about making it B12.
Okay.
So it's very important that we consider what happens before they come to kindergarten. And we're working to have greater conversation between those two worlds so that the preschool teacher knows that they are essentials that that child needs when he or she leaves a preschool setting and comes into kindergarten. So P20 does focus on that. They're very interested in what's happening in that younger set of years, as well as what happens in for the older ones. So it's pretty interesting. P20 Council covers a wide scope.
Mm-hmm. And I think when the P was in there to add to that, thank you, Secretary Bunting, is that we also heard some conversation at the last meeting around, I think it was actually Ray and a few others talking about the P piece as well. So I think it's just looking at that continuum and making sure that they can all progress and succeed. Do we have any other questions or concerns about this recommendation?
So basically this is about getting more information, right?
This is the information sharing back and forth and making sure there's a structure in place where they're doing it more. I think we heard, thinking back to the conversations that we had, that a lot of it wasn't necessarily formalized in many cases. In some cases it is, but it's just making sure that it's definitely happening.
Ready to move on?
And then this next one goes back to some of what Shelley was saying before. It was actually interesting. Right after our last work group meeting, I was at an event at the university where they were talking about teacher residency programs throughout the state and sharing who currently has them, as well as it sounds like all of the higher eds are either exploring or piloting a program within the next year. So this one just talks about making sure that we develop and expand the residencies for educators and administrator candidates in high need schools. So I think that's starting to get, Shelley, and correct me if I'm wrong, because it would be the first time, in the high need schools areas. So we're looking at, again, supporting and increasing the teacher pipeline, especially within the high need schools for this.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. And then the next one, this was a piece within the Grow Your Own as well. It was talking about teacher salaries and increasing them in meaningful ways. So the work group recommends that the state work with the LEAs or the state to address the financial incentive packages, such as teacher salaries and non-monetary compensation. So this would just be trying to figure out where you could, or, I mean, I know we don't know where the budget is going to be in a year from now, considering everything going on, but this was just something that the work group.
Yeah, I think we're
But
good.
if loan forgiveness or something like that can be achieved, that is salary, really. I mean, when you're strapped with that as a beginning teacher. So if things like that make space, like, you know, if things like increasing teacher salary aren't able to get attention, if things like the loan forgiveness program can be funneled in this direction and expanded, that would be just as strong.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're ready to move on to the next point.
Next one. So this one goes back, this is from what was recommendation 4, creating a whole school professional learning package. And we had talked about putting it in the high need schools within the city of Wilmington. That might be something we have to readjust after our conversation from earlier. And this was based off of the success that we have seen in Seaford and Laurel. So just the blue piece that we had talked about earlier, I just want to make sure everybody was okay with the Office of Innovation and Improvement at DOE, could leverage aid from higher eds and other organizations to do some of this, whether it's the higher eds doing the work and the professional development and all of that, but also that the legislature would work with DOE in determining how much would be needed to run a program in one school, 2 schools, depending upon what is decided.
So I'm wondering if Jim has anything to weigh in on this one, since it's specifically about the Office of Innovation and Improvement.
I certainly think that if my office is overseeing those schools in the city, I think it should come out of my office. What that looks like, I don't know that the Office of Improvement is the person to come up with that on its own. So I think it is working with the IHEs to try to develop what that looks like. I think it should come out of my office. I think it's the second part of that is, what does that look like and what does it entail? So I think that's the bigger piece. I don't know that we need to add that in. I think it's stated properly.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's true.
Any other concerns about that before we move on to the next point? Okay.
I like that. So then the last recommendation that we are addressing in this current document was, it had come up earlier, and we had talked about supporting a diverse teacher workforce, is looking at cohorts of teachers and administrators of colors for the purpose of preparing the next generation of teachers and administrators, as well as supporting current teachers. So districts would be creating these cohorts within their district schools. They could help build recruitment efforts and help diversify the teacher field or teaching field. So we're just talking about looking at data to use would be does the diversity of these schools look like of their teachers now, and then what does it look like if these cohorts are put in as well?
Anyone's thoughts before we move on?
I don't know if this is the right place, but I do remember the consortium, they had asked about other people in the school besides teachers, like the counselors and support staff, that every job needs to be diversified in that school. And we had talked about changing the language somewhere to reflect that. And I don't remember if this is the place, but it seems like it might be.
We could go back and check, but we could also say it could be cohorts of educators of
Right.
color.
Well, I think we were talking beyond educators, like nurses, counselors, all of the support staff, thinking about that. And that we had kind of said we would come back and discuss that.
All those people are on teacher contracts. So, you know, it's just a general term we use to include most of the staff at the school, not the nutrition workers and custodians, but all the other people that are on teacher contracts could fall into that educator piece. But I agree that we need to look at diversity with the guidance counselors as well as the teachers, and as well as, we probably only have one nurse in a school. That one's a little harder, but other people come in groups, and we do need to look at all those groups for diversity.
And just to clarify, Secretary, would the school counselors fall under the educator umbrella?
Most of them have been teachers.
Okay.
And they do have a teacher contract.
Okay, thank you. And Noelle, I can also go back and look at my notes and listen to the recording from the last meeting just to make sure that we're addressing the question that they had.
Any other concerns before we move on? So we ready to go on to the what does the group see for the next steps part, Kelly?
I think so.
So
Can I just go back a little bit, Kelly? Just the
Yep.
thought. I know, but the title of the last recommendation was recommendations for supporting a diverse workforce within the schools, maybe instead of just teacher workforce.
Okay.
I don't know,
Or
just a possibility, rephrasing it, not lobbying for it.
Can we just say educator?
Educator.
Well, and I think it depends on, you know, the audience who's reading it, because I know Secretary Bunting understands that the teacher contract is a broad term, but some of the people in the consortium didn't understand that. They were thinking of just teachers being included, and that everyone else was not included. So
I think what we could do in the beginning of the document, and as we're move forward, we could put something in there that defines educators are and work with to make
And
sure
I
we
think
include everybody.
It's also important that we don't get lost here and remember what every other strategy is aiming to do here as well. I mean, everything we've talked about has been about teachers. So if we're broadening that, there are other aspects of the work that would need to address school counselors and such. Those aren't things that we really have paid attention to in the other areas either, or administrators for that matter. So it could just be that this work ends up being replicated for a broader scale of educators.
Unless you tie it into recommendations for a whole school reform model, you know.
Yeah, I think depending on which point we're talking about, I agree with you. And I think that's why when that was brought up at the consortium, my first response was, we're really just focusing on teachers. But I don't want to be dismissive of that comment. And I agree also with what Fran was saying, if we're looking at the whole school package, that might include other people under the teacher contract, but we're mainly focusing on teachers.
Ray has a question. Ray?
She might be on
Is he
mute.
calling my name?
Yeah,
Yes.
you have that hand thing up.
I did, well, I had typed a question, but to the point that's being discussed now, we talked before, and then it came up of several times when we made these recommendations to the larger group, that we really need to acknowledge that these efforts are needed for related personnel, not just classroom teachers. And so I think that we should acknowledge it, you know, with the caveat that steps have to be taken in phases, but just not ignore that related personnel are really key, as we all know, in all schools, but particularly in schools that are serving traumatized communities. The question that I have, district's efforts. Did you get that?
Yeah, can you repeat that? You cut off.
Oh, okay. That's because she's switching screens. The question I had typed was about district recruitment and to do a better job with diversity. Did you get that question?
I don't see it. It didn't show up.
Not in regard to diversity. The one I see is around scholarship recipients.
Okay, so the question around diversity in terms of recruitment efforts is that districts have the ability and the authority to do that now. So my question is, what's going to be different? Are they going to be incentivized, or is it going to be more of a mandate? What's going to be different? Because districts can do that now if they choose to.
I think originally we were talking about the incentive option and trying to think through that. And even to add on to what you had said previously, other personnel, I did have a chance to speak with John Sheehan to think about the zone idea that we had and to think through how other personnel could work into that in the city of Wilmington. So, but back to your point, I do think that had to do with incentivizing.
Okay, so is the expectation that there will be some examples of what those incentives?
Ray, you broke up again. Do we lose her?
Ray, you there? I didn't get that last part.
I just heard her say something about examples of incentivizing.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Is the expectation that we will come back with a few examples or a few models of incentivizing districts around diversity? I mean, we've given examples of other types of strategies and other recommendations.
No, you're totally right about that. In terms of the expectation itself, though, I'm honestly, I don't believe we set that expectation, but to your point, if we're going to give examples for others, we should. But I don't think that expectation was mandated or we thought through that yet. Please clarify if I'm wrong.
Is this about incentivizing districts or coming up with incentives that districts can use to incentivize candidates to come to their district? I'm hearing
it's both.
Yeah, it's both.
I think it's a good question. I was always thinking of it in terms of the recruitment and the the programs, the residency kind of programs, and who we were focusing on, but there's no guarantee that that's actually creating results unless we look at, you know, the end result of whether or not schools are increasing the diversity of their teachers.
And there is a viewpoint that there is an implicit bias in or implicit biases in district hiring practices. So we're not going to answer the question today, but I definitely wanted to raise those points.
Okay.
Thank
I
you.
think for the IPA team, let's circle up after this and figure out how we can look into that a little more.
Absolutely.
And maybe also look at what are some other practices that have worked that we could use as a model.
And Ray, if you have any examples either from previous work or your work that you could send us as examples, that would be great as well to look into that, and others. But since we're here, the question.
Sure.
Or what doesn't work, that would be helpful too.
Yes, that's true.
Okay. So we get back to the whoops.
Okay, Kelly.
Hold on. Getting there. Did I open it? So, next steps. There's two kind of rounds of next steps. I don't know, Noelle and Mike, do you want to talk through this slide?
Sure. So after this, we're going to try to circle up and finish any updates so we can kind of give you a review by March 31st. And then we kind of need to, with all the editing and feedback and process that we go through, we want to be able to give to the full consortium by April 15th. And then present it so that April 22nd meeting is locked in. Is that correct, Kelly? Okay.
Yes, it is.
We'll be giving it over this wonderful Zoom thing that we have going here, so that should make it even more interesting. Luckily, some of us know the hand raising option already. So we'll think through that and try to flush it out. Will this be the next consortium meeting, or is one scheduled before then?
So the April 22nd is the next consortium meeting.
And so what will the update, will we be the show, or will there be a, okay, so every other business and redistricting will be a part of that?
Correct. So thinking back to the last meeting, how redistricting had a 20-minute, we haven't fully gotten to the time, so don't hold me to 20 minutes, but we'll have a time to give an update and share where we are and get any other feedback from the consortium at the April 22nd meeting. But I believe as of now, the bulk of the meeting will be the redistricting work group sharing where they are.
Okay. All right, does anybody have any questions, concerns, comments about the timeline? Okay, hearing none.
Mike, I just want to say, as far as like the grander timeline, the idea is for the next consortium meeting, right, that when we present, that we want them ideally to have as few questions as possible, or if they have a few, that we can address them, because we're not doing like another big presentation for the consortium. So
Correct.
I guess the question right now is, how do we get to that point where this is enough detail that we think that there's not going to be any concerns or questions?
Well, so the last one we presented, it was based off of, we needed to come back with their specific, with answers to their specific questions. And I think if we hone into that and based off what we give to them on April 15th, that should hopefully flush out any remaining questions that we can then answer quickly on the 22nd versus taking more time afterwards. Tell me if I'm wrong about that, but I think that's the hope.
So the guiding question about our path forward for now is did we answer the questions?
Mhm.
And, you know, will just communicating a bit by email to edit it be able to address that enough to our satisfaction? Is that correct?
That's part of the next, yes.
Okay.
Mike, as a legislator, but also the whole group.
I'm a call center manager now, Fran.
You're a Zoom manager, right?
Yeah.
The big question back down the line is going to be, how much is this going to cost?
Yep. And, you know, I kind of wanted to bring that up, I guess, to either finish this or start with new business. But I think that's something that we could talk about, but there'd be no rhyme or reason or strategy on how we're even going to approach the legislative body at this point about our work, to be honest with you. I just want to be upfront with everybody. I mean, we're in a completely different world right now than when we you started this process and been moving through this process. And, you know, just the unemployment line is the largest, you know, we've had. We have to think of relief packages for different sectors and businesses and groups themselves. So it's not something that we're going to be able to answer. I mean, we still have to, we're out indefinitely as a legislative body as well around this. So we don't even have our bond bill or JFC groups down there to be able to flesh that out. And that's going to be something we're going to have to turn around quickly. So, you know, my fear is that some of these recommendations, if they're legislative, will have to wait. But if they're monetary, it's something that hopefully in May or June we get added into a budget where we can hopefully get passed. But that's, you know, we're going to, I think, have to get to the point now where to balance a budget again versus having all this extra cash on new projects. So I just wanted to, you know, make sure everyone's on the same page with that. Obviously do and advocate what we can, but we're going to have to make some hard decisions, I think.
So maybe start thinking about prioritizing. I hear you, totally hear you, you know, and it's going to get worse, I think.
Yes, it absolutely is. So I think, you know, even when we have our next consortium meeting on the 22nd, there's going to be so much change. It's going to be so much change by tomorrow too. I mean, They just obviously put out that schools won't be going back till at least May 15th either.
Right.
So, you know, look, that's something we're all going to have to deal with, and the cost and delivery and all of that. I mean, that's something, no matter if you're on this task force or not, you should be given a lot of thoughts on how we can help and ideas around what all this looks like. Because, you know, student standards all the way to delivery, the equity behind delivery, everything is something that we need to take a hard look at. And it's something that people are having to adapt to on the fly, which, you know, is going to hurt a lot of people, teachers, students, families, everybody. So I would actually—
My life.
Sorry, go ahead, Susan.
I said, welcome to my life right now.
Yeah, that's why she's living in an office, it looks like.
Yeah.
Well, I'm still here right now, but literally for the last, since Friday a week ago, we've worked day and night all through the weekends. But we do have a date now, and it will make a difference. In fact, I was on with legislators from the House right before I joined you all. And I think they're questioning when you will come back. If we're all out and sort of sheltered and not to be doing certain things, do you all stay out until May the 15th,
Right.
which you have a very short season. You know, by law, we have to have things settled by June 30th with the budget and so forth, but that really cuts the legislative opportunities short.
Yep.
So stay
I
tuned.
truly just think from a perspective of what we're doing, like, and as a legislator in my mind, I know we're going to be on a redacted timeline that's much different than what we've been given. And so for me, my focus is the budget, the bond bill, and grant aid. And it's hard to think about policy changes at this point, to be perfectly blunt.
Mm-hmm.
And this is Kelly, I'm going to jump in really quick. And I think when we do speak to the consortium, when you do speak to them, we do need to bring that up, that when we originally started all this back in November, December, we had the thought of getting something legislative policy. But the fact that there has been such a change in the past week, 2 weeks,
And this
that,
is catastrophic. You know, this isn't something that any of us can change. So this is catastrophic. That we can all wrap our heads around that and move forward. If it means change in terms of continuing our work with a resolution or something, we can absolutely do that too and think through that process of our work so we can maybe implement changes in 2021 potentially, right? Or 2022 based off the next budget. So I think we all need to think through that too.
Yeah, this is Noelle. I think that's all really good points. And I'm thinking about back to the beginning when we first started meeting, we had a ton of ideas that we still have on record. And we tried to lean into those recommendations that were more policy budget oriented because of that was the purpose. But there were a lot of ideas that we had that were more focused on things that could be done within the school or within the district or the Department of Education. And we didn't necessarily have a high dollar amount. And so we could always, if we have to pivot back into those, and also these contemporary questions. I know Secretary Bunting is wrestling with a lot around the equity of educating students in this environment right now. You know, if we want to address that in terms of equity and our look at what our place is in that discussion as the consortium, you know, maybe then we do continue working and we pivot a bit and we think about what are our short-term and long-term recommendations a little differently now, because what was a short-term recommendation might now become
Long-term.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think those are good ideas, Noelle. And as we look at what we're doing as we move forward, we are going to have to rethink a lot of things. So the equity piece can be played out in a very different way.
With that, I just want to ask, I guess, to move on, is there any new business for the group? I think we just talked about it, so I think that we're fine. Okay. So at this point, Kelly, I guess we're going to go to public comment. I'll be honest, I have no idea how that's about to work, so maybe you can let me know. Thank you.
I would say if any of the members of public have comments or would like to share anything, if they can either raise their hand on the side by under parts, or just jump in.
Yeah, and
State who you
remember,
are.
when you jump in, you have to state your name for the record, please. Well, that makes it easier, doesn't it? Going once, going twice. Okay. Well, look, I just want to thank everybody for coming on this call tonight. I know this is not how everybody would prefer to meet and prefer to do work, but honestly, I think it went a lot more smoothly than I expected, and that's probably because we've all been on so many Zoom calls over the last
I know. We're going to be experts. We go to meetings and Zoom calls.
Yeah, but I really, truly do appreciate everybody's work in this regard and your input. You've all been fantastic. I know you've all taught me a lot of things and helped me learn things, and we'll keep moving forward so we can meet these timelines and these deadlines. And again, aside from this, any input, advice, you know, anything you have for what we're going to be dealing with here over the next several weeks would be a good thing. I think all ideas and recommendations are good. And I think we all need to rally around each other and, more importantly, stay positive through all of it, because we'll stay positive and come out of it strong if we can do that. And if anybody has any last comments, I'd have a motion to, I wouldn't say dismiss like I'm in school or something, but yeah, you know what I mean.
I actually do have one comment I'd like to make. I know we're all really focused on the catastrophic situation that we're in right now, and it's going to take a lot to deal with it. But I also just want to mention that this could be an opportunity to really re-examine some of our practices and put in place some transformative ideas in schools. I just want to throw that out there as a beacon of hope and opportunity, even in this difficult time.
Well, that's a really good point. And one thing that we've learned, and we're only 6 days into this, but we can save people a lot of time by using Zoom and go-to meetings. And maybe that's not our preferred way of communicating with each other, but it can be more expedient and it's really handy. I know people complain about driving an hour to get to Dover for a meeting that doesn't last more than an hour. So that's
I think there's a live streaming bill out there for that, Susan. Don't worry.
right. The other thing that we're really trying to take a look at, and I'm bad about this, I feel I need to be here in this building, except when I'm out in schools. But we're really going to experiment with the telecommuting piece and see if it really has more to offer than we've thought about in the past, just for people's health and well-being and on down the line. So we're anxious to see how that plays out.
Yeah, and I think, look, our state was ranked with an F, a grade of an F for IT infrastructure by U.S. News and World Report. And I think this just gives us a ripe opportunity in a really bad situation to think through those things, like Noelle said. So I think this will definitely make us better.
So thank you for the pep talk. We needed it today.
Yeah, hoorah.
Hoorah.
Do I have a second for my motion?
Second and third.
All in favor?
Aye.
Awesome. Well, thank you guys so much. And thank you to the IPA team for getting this organized for us tonight. I hope everybody has a good evening, and we'll talk soon.
Thank
Stay
you.
well.
Be well.
Bye, everybody. Stay healthy.
See ya.
Be well, everyone.